I woke up on November 3rd already braced for silence. That's the rhythm I grew up with, my birthday arriving like a quiet train no one bothered to meet. For years, there was always a reason. A work trip. A recital. A vague cold. I learned to throw my own tiny dinner, blow out a candle alone, then answer texts that landed days later. How many times can you accept crumbs and call it cake? By 29, I had stopped asking for more. I poured myself into work instead. I design restaurant interiors in Denver, warm wood, clean lines, lighting that makes strangers feel like regulars. My downtown loft became my favorite project, the place where I learned how calm can look. Still, every November felt the same. What do you buy when the people who raised you won't show up? 3 weeks before my birthday, I drove into the Rockies with a thermos of coffee and a knot in my chest. A listing had caught my eye, small cedar lodge too. 5 wooded acres, big windows facing a reservoir, private dock. I told myself I was just looking. I was not. I pulled into the gravel drive and the air changed. Pine, cold water, quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't punish you. Inside, the lodge smelled like wood and clean dust. A stone fireplace waited like it knew my name. The retired couple who owned it greeted me with soft voices and patient smiles. They were ready to move closer to their grandkids. I was ready to stop making excuses for people who wouldn't move an inch for me. We stood at the big window and watched light climb over the water. I heard my heartbeat and, under it, a simple truth, mine. We closed fast. No drama. No borrowed money. Savings from years of design jobs and careful choices. I signed, shook hands, and carried a single box to the car, 2 blankets, and a bottle of champagne for later. I drove back to Denver with the window cracked, the cold air cutting through my breath like a promise. Would you have done the same? On my birthday weekend, I finally brought people who never made me beg. Maya, my anchor in scrubs and sneakers. Ethan, the sarcasm king with good timing. Nina, who heals everything with butter and sugar. They burst into my loft with a portable speaker, a 3-layer cake, and the kind of noise that makes neighbors forgive you. We threw bags into the trunk and headed for the mountains. The reservoir appeared like polished glass between dark trees. We rolled down the windows and cheered at nothing, because sometimes nothing is everything. At the lodge, Maya claimed the broom, Ethan figured out the finicky heater, and Nina lined the counter with snacks like we were feeding a small town. I uncorked the champagne with a wince and a laugh. Foam hissed down my hand. The bottle felt cold and heavy, like a door I could finally close. We spent the afternoon on the dock, jackets zipped, sun crisp on our faces. Ethan streamed an old playlist. The speaker popped once, then settled. We played dumb games that turned into better stories. First jobs. Worst dates. Best meals. I told them how every November I had waited for a knock that never came. They listened without fixing me. That's rarer than gifts. When the sun dropped, we moved inside. Fire snapped, throwing orange light across cedar beams. Nina cut the cake with a chef's seriousness and a friend's mercy, thick slices, too much frosting. Maya raised a paper cup and said we were here to start a new tradition, one where I don't apologize for being born. I laughed and felt something warm in it. I didn't say it out loud, but I believed her. Later, when everyone had drifted toward sleep, I stood at the big window with a blanket around my shoulders. The water held the moon like a secret it was willing to share. My phone sat face down on the table. No texts from family. No, sorry we missed it. The silence didn't bite this time. It just was. I set the phone to do not disturb and let the fire slow. I took a few photos before bed, the dock in moonlight, the fireplace, a corner where the shadows made the room feel safe. I imagined a wildflower path curving from the steps to the water in spring. I pictured mornings here, coffee steaming while the light changed across the reservoir. The life inside that picture felt simple, honest, mine. I fell asleep to crackling wood and the soft hum of the heater. For the first time on my birthday, I felt full instead of hungry. I didn't know it yet, but those quiet photos were going to start a storm. The lodge woke up before I did. Light slid across the beams, slow and gold, and the reservoir breathed a thin veil of mist. I pulled on boots, wrapped my hands around a hot mug, and walked the property line like a quiet promise. Pine needles cracked. A blue jay heckled me from a branch. I pictured wildflowers along the path, lupin, paintbrush, the kind that keep color even in thin air. I took a few photos. The dock wearing frost. The cedar walls glowing like honey. A corner by the fireplace where shadows made the room feel older than me, but kinder. Back in Denver that evening, I posted 3 shots with a simple caption about having the best birthday I'd ever had. Nothing braggy. Just proof to myself that joy can be recorded. Monday, life snapped back to angles and deadlines. I opened the farm-to-table project on my screen, soft greens, matte brass, banquettes that should invite a second drink. I adjusted a pendant height, tweaked a render, and let the coffee go cold while the computer hummed. Notifications nudged the edge of my phone. Then pushed. Then flooded. First, my mother. Multiple messages, stacked and urgent. She never texts like that unless a charity gala needs rearranging. Then my father. Short lines, no punctuation, all command. Finally, my sister, too many exclamation points from Monday morning. Not one of them mentioned my birthday. Every single one said we needed to discuss the house. Not the lodge. The house. It sounded like a closing argument. I set the phone face down and kept revising my light plan. The dining room glowed perfectly on the screen. My chest did not. Another round of pings rattled the wood. I turned off notifications and breathed, counting backward from 10 the way Maya taught me after hard days. Who knew a few pictures could summon so much sudden family? By lunch, the emails started. Subject lines, urgent. Call US. This isn't like you. My mother insisted the post concerned her because friends were asking questions. My father wrote that major purchases should be transparent within the family. Chelsea chimed in about the kids loving the lake in summer, which sounded sweet until the next line about fairness. Isn't it funny how love speeds up when a property line appears? I typed nothing. I saved the render and sent a clean update to the client. Then I put my phone on airplane mode and walked 3 blocks for a sandwich I barely tasted. The sky over Denver felt too bright, like it was daring me to blink. I didn't. I went back to work and did the one thing no one in my family respects. I stayed focused. By evening, the building was quiet, the kind of quiet that holds your footsteps for you. I drove home, parked, and climbed the stairs to my loft. My key was halfway to the lock when I heard it, voices. Familiar. Soft through the door, like they belonged inside already. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like missing a step in the dark. I opened to a tableau I know too well. My mother with that curated smile she uses for collaborations and apologies. My father standing slightly ahead, on the edge of the threshold like a foreman entering his site. Chelsea behind them, hands buried in her coat, eyes flicking to me, then away. No one had texted they were coming. Of course not. Why ask for space when taking it is faster? Old training kicked in. I moved aside and said they could come in. Reflex, not consent. They brushed past, warm air and expensive fragrance slipping under my collar. My mother looked over my living room with a blogger's eye, fingers grazing the console like she was checking for dust. My father scanned the shelves, the plants, the framed concept sketches on the wall, as if inventorying my life by square foot. Chelsea whispered hi without moving closer. I caught the shape of exhaustion in her face, a long shadow she didn't have when we were teenagers. For half a second, I wondered if she came as a buffer or a witness. Maybe neither. Maybe both. They sat without asking. My mother crossed her legs and arranged her coat like a still life. My father leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands laced, wedding ring flashing a quick line of light. I stayed standing. The heater clicked on somewhere behind us, and for a ridiculous moment I wished it were the lodge fire instead. My mother started with warmth dulled at the edges. She said she was happy I'd had a nice weekend, and how the photos were lovely, and how friends were buzzing, which sounded less like pride and more like PR. My father cut through the sentiment like a blade through paper. He said we needed to discuss the house as a family. His voice carried the old message underneath, you do not act alone. I felt my shoulders lower and square at the same time. I told them I was listening, But briefly, I had work in the morning. My mother smiled tighter. Chelsea shifted like a person caught between fire and wind. My father glanced at my sketches again, then back at me. The pause was long enough for the room to grow edges. He finally spoke, low and certain, like he was opening a meeting that had already been decided somewhere else. This is family business. We're going to handle it together. I felt the familiar gravity of those words tug at my ribs. Then I remembered cold air over the reservoir and the crackle of my own fireplace. I took a breath that tasted like steel. What exactly did together mean tonight, and what would it cost me if I nodded? The room felt crowded by things unsaid. My father laced and unlaced his fingers once, then fixed on me like a target. He asked why I hadn't told them about the lodge. Not angry, worse. Manager calm. I answered just as simply, I didn't involve anyone because I paid for it myself. The words landed clean and stayed standing. My mother smiled like a moderator and said the property was obviously family space. She painted pictures, Chelsea's kids on the dock, summer cookouts, Christmas at the fire. She used warmth like a tool. I could feel the handle in her hand. Chelsea nodded along, eyes dim, like someone agreeing to weather. I asked a quiet question, why is it family now, when my birthdays never were? The silence that followed had teeth. My mother called birthdays childish. My father added that life gets busy, that I should be grateful for all we've done. The word grateful slid across the floor like oil. He pivoted to numbers. He said a fair solution was to sign over 50% of the lodge to the family, to recognize the investments they made in me school, a leg up, connections. He talked like a ledger wearing a suit. I reminded him I had no loans on the lodge, no cosigner, and that not one of them had called me on the day I bought it or on my birthday. He blinked once, as if facts were an inconvenience. Chelsea mentioned again how much the kids would love the lake. I said they could visit as guests. My mother's smile cooled. She called me dramatic. Ungrateful. The room's air changed shape. My father leaned forward until the coffee table seemed to tip toward him. He told me families share assets, and individual ownership was selfish. He said we needed to bring it under the family umbrella. I heard the old subtext, your inventory. My chest went tight, not from fear recognition. Would you hand over half your home to prove you belong? I said no. Not soft. Not sorry. Just no. I told them the lodge is in my name alone, paid with my earnings. I told them I won't be carving it into pieces to feed anyone's image or needs. The heater clicked again behind me, steady as a heartbeat I could borrow. My mother tried the guilt setting. She reminded me of tuition deposits and holidays she orchestrated, as if planning equals love. She said it would look bad if people knew I had excluded family. The word look did too much work in that sentence. My father shifted strategies, the threat wrapped as advice. He said Denver is a small community. People talk. Reputation matters. He said doors can open and doors can close. I felt something in me settle like sand finding its level. I asked him if that was a warning. He said I was taking it that way. His wedding ring flashed again, small flare, quick fade. My loft suddenly felt like a set. He stood. The meeting tone was back, brisk and efficient. He gave me 72 hours to reconsider and do the right thing. After that, he said, he'd let the process work. You don't want this to get messy, he added, voice low, a hand on the back of my couch as if to steady the furniture from my stubbornness. I asked what messy meant. He smiled without humor and said he'd always protected me from the harsher side of business, but if I insisted on acting alone, he couldn't guarantee how people would interpret that. Interpret. Such a tidy word for sabotage. My mother rose and kissed the air near my cheek. She told me to sleep on it, that I was emotional, that we were trying to help. Chelsea lingered a second too long, like she wanted to speak, then followed them to the door. The hallway light washed over their coats. For a beat, we were a painting I didn't recognize. The lock slid into place with a sound that felt like choosing. I stood in the quiet and watched my hands shake, palms buzzing with adrenaline that had nowhere to go. I texted Maya a single line, they want half. Threats were made. She replied immediately, breathing exercise, water, no decisions tonight. I did all three. The water tasted like metal. On my coffee table, a candle flickered down, tunneling into itself. I blew it out and opened the window an inch. November air rushed in, honest and cold, and I thought of the reservoir. I pictured the dock in moonlight, the way it held me steady. The lodge wasn't a prize to fight over. It was the life I would rather build than beg for. I grabbed a notebook and wrote the timeline while it was fresh, what they said, what I answered, the exact words 50%, family umbrella, and 72 hours. I underlined the phrase small community twice. My pen carved a groove in the paper. When you write a thing down, it becomes real enough to defend. My phone buzzed once more. A new email from my father, time-stamped like a contract. He summarized his offer and the deadline, called it a fair acknowledgement, urged me not to create a rift. He CC'd my mother and Chelsea like witnesses. The message ended with a line I could hear in his voice, "Let's keep this dignified." I stared at the screen until the letters softened. Dignity is not handing over what you earned to stop a rumor. Dignity is not letting someone hold your future because they held your past. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark a while longer, listening to Denver breathe under my window, and asked myself the only question that mattered. When the 72 hours end, who am I going to be? The kettle screamed before I did. I pulled it off the burner and watched steam coil like a thought I didn't want. My hands still shook from the 72-hour clock ticking inside my ribs. I opened the group chat, Maya, Ethan, Nina, and dumped the whole scene in clipped lines, timestamps included. I added the email. I added the words 50% and reputation. They didn't answer with pity. They answered with clarity. Maya called it coercion. Ethan called it extortion with a family discount. Nina told me to save everything, texts, emails, voicemails, and to stop meeting anyone without a witness. Their certainty slowed my breathing. I took photos of the messages and forwarded the email to a folder named Lodge Legal. Naming it helped. Filing pain into proof is a strange relief. Then I called Marisol. Her voice is measured, like someone who irons facts until they lay flat. I told her the short version and then the long one. She asked for the address, the purchase details, how the title was held. Sole ownership. No liens. No cosigner. She hummed once, a small sound that felt like a green light. She said my parents had no legal standing to demand any portion, and that their deadline was theater unless they filed a case. She asked me to document the threat about my reputation word for word. She said, "Do not respond substantively. Direct all contact to me. If they escalate, we escalate." Something inside me unclenched. Another part braced. I told her I wouldn't surrender any part of the lodge. Not for peace. Not for show. Not to keep a door open I'd outgrown. Marisol repeated, "Save every contact, date everything, stay calm." She said we could send a soft cease and desist if the rumor mill started turning. I said I'd wait and watch. She said, "I'll be here." I ended the call and stood with my forehead against the cool window. Below, Denver kept existing, buses, dogs, strangers with coffee and destinations. I pressed my palms flat and felt skin, glass, the faint vibration of traffic, like the city breathing. Would you hold the line if it meant losing people who were supposed to be yours? As the clock ran down, the space around me thinned. I worked. I ate what Nina told me to eat, real food, not fear. I slept in short chapters. My phone stayed on the table, screen down, like a small animal I didn't want to startle. On the last afternoon, I cleaned the kitchen for no reason, as if lemon and order could protect me. At 4:18 p.m. a knock. Not the pounding kind, one, then two, a pause, and a third like permission. I looked through the peephole and exhaled a name I'd been holding all day. Chelsea. Alone. A paper cup in one hand, her tote in the other, shoulders dropped like she'd set something heavy down and couldn't pick it up again. I opened the door. She stepped in, eyes scanning for our parents like she didn't trust her own escape. Up close she looked, tired. The curated big sister polish had a crack through it. She handed me the coffee without meeting my eyes and said she was sorry for showing up unannounced. I felt the old pull to say, "It's okay." I didn't. I said, What's going on? She sat at the edge of the couch like she might run. Words came out shaped like smoke. She said she was sorry for years of letting attention funnel her way, sorry for calling the lodge a family asset, sorry for picking the easy side because it was the only side she'd ever been given. She said something had snapped when she watched our parents walk out of my loft like they owned the air. Then she told me what I needed and didn't want. She'd overheard them on the phone with a lawyer. They were discussing a family loan, 6 figures, supposedly given to me years ago for real estate opportunities. They planned to allege it in court, file for a lien, and tie up the asset until I came to my senses. There were details, dates, phrases, strategy, repeated like lines from a play. She thought she heard 230, maybe 230,000, spoken like an invoice for my independence. The room tilted and then snapped back. Heat went in my face. Cold went in my wrists. I asked questions the way Marisol would. When did you hear this? Who was on the call? What exactly was said? Chelsea answered as best she could. Afternoon. Speakerphone. Dad. Mom. A man with a patient voice. Phrases like document narrative, family understanding, good faith. My pen squeaked across the page, writing down words that sounded harmless if you didn't know how they'd be used. Chelsea's hands trembled in her lap. She said our father was also talking about assets he could liquidate quickly to patch temporary gaps at work. She said he kept calling my lodge low-hanging fruit. Then she said the thing that moved me and made me angry at the same time. I think he's desperate, Lo. He will ruin you to fix himself. Silence pressed into the space between us. I watched her swallow. I watched years of golden child immunity flicker. She looked up finally and asked if I hated her. I told her I didn't. I told her hate took too much space, and I needed that space for staying upright. Her mouth twitched, a half-smile haunted by math. She nodded and said she understood. I forwarded everything to Marisol with a note. New info, fake family loan. Possible amount, $230K. She replied within minutes, precise and steady. She called it a classic pressure tactic, create a story, force me into expensive defense, starve me until surrender feels like relief. She told me to pull bank statements, tax returns, and investment records for the past 6 years and to bring them in the morning. She would begin drafting a response and an evidence binder. We will meet fiction with paper, she wrote. I stared at that line until the screen blurred. Meet fiction with paper. I could do that. I knew how to build things that hold weight. I knew how to make a room feel safe and honest. Maybe I could do the same for my life. Chelsea stood to go. At the door, she paused, fingers on the handle, and said she was done being the reason I was alone on my birthday. I didn't know what to do with that promise, so I put it on a shelf in my chest and hoped it wouldn't fall. After she left, the apartment felt both lighter and more dangerous, like a storm had passed and left wires down. I laid out folders on the table and labeled them with a thick black pen: income, savings, investments, expenses, lodge. The act of sorting made my heartbeat slow. The timer on my father's ultimatum ticked toward 0, somewhere past the window. My phone lit the room once, an email from him, brisk and cold, reminding me of 5 p.m. and dignity. I didn't answer. I turned it face down and stacked my first 3 statements in the investments folder. I felt the smallest click inside, like a door settling into its frame. Would you rather be called ungrateful today than owned forever? The clock on the stove hit 4:59. And then, right on time, another message arrived, short, formal, and designed to bruise. The email landed at 5 p.m. on the dot. Subject line: Family Equity Deadline. The body read like a press release wearing a threat. He summarized his offer, repeated 50%, and gave me until Monday at 5 p.m. to deed over half the lodge to the family or face legal action and the disappointment of everyone who loved me. He CC'd my mother and Chelsea like witnesses to a performance. I felt my jaw set before my thoughts did. I forwarded it to Marisol with a single word: received. Then I opened a blank note and started another timeline. Dates. Times. Phrases exactly as written. I screenshotted headers and saved the message to a folder named Proof. Paper has weight. Lies don't. Morning brought a task I could hold, a stack of truth. I logged into every account I own. Bank checking and savings. Brokerage. Credit cards. The tax portal with my old 1099s. I printed statements for 6 years, the paper curling warm against my hand as it slid from the tray. I added my contract invoices, retainer deposits, the wire confirmation to the title company, the closing disclosure from the lodge purchase. I 3-hole punched each set and labeled tabs with a thick marker: income, savings, investments, lodge, tax. The table filled until my apartment looked like a war room made of receipts. Across pages, my life became lines and numbers that made sense. Deposits from restaurants I designed. Quarterly estimated taxes. Small dividends from a cautious index fund I set up at 24 because no one was going to catch me if I fell. Every dollar had an origin. No 6-figure mystery money. No family loan. If this was a story, my chapters were dated and signed. As I sorted, fragments of other years surfaced. The time I redesigned my mother's home office for free for the exposure. The months I watched Chelsea's kids every Saturday so she could recalibrate. The vacation I didn't take because my father wanted me available for a cousin's wedding weekend that ended up being a photo op. A pattern came into focus. My usefulness had always worn the mask of closeness. By noon, the binder weighed heavy in my hands. I drove to Marisol's office and slid it across her desk like a shield. She flipped through the tabs, methodical, her finger tracing totals I already knew by heart. "Good," she said, and her voice made the floor feel sturdier. She asked me to email PDFs so she could build an evidence index. She said she'd begin drafting a formal response and that if any rumors started touching my clients, we'd expand our scope. Document names, dates, and exact words, she reminded me. We'll need tone and timing. On the way home, Denver felt too bright again, but it didn't glare as hard. I stopped for groceries like a person with a future. Apples. Pasta. Heavy cream because Nina's voice in my head said calories are courage. Back at my place, I uploaded clean scans, named each file with the month and year, and sent the whole archive to Marisol. A reply pinged. Received. Excellent records. Hold steady. Evening brought noise I actually wanted. A knock, then laughter I'd know in the dark. Maya led with a bag of takeout balance like a trophy. Ethan held 2 bottles of decent wine and a movie he promised would lower our collective IQ in a healing way. Nina slid in last with a bakery box that smelled like butter and gratitude. They didn't ask permission to help. They simply arrived. They set their phones in a bowl near the door, Maya's rule for nights that need air. "No family talk for 2 hours," she announced, handing me a glass of water before anything else. We ate garlic noodles too fast and let the sauce ruin a dish towel on purpose. Ethan narrated the worst lines of the movie in a solemn whisper that had me snorting. Nina cut lemon bars into greedy squares and said, "Chew. Then breathe." For 2 hours, we pretended the world could be simple. Salt, laughter, a ridiculous plot, and the clean relief of being seen without a price tag. The tight drumbeat in my chest softened to a steady tap. I let my shoulders drop. I let the couch hold me up. For 10 whole minutes, I forgot about subject lines and deadlines and the exact weight of paper. When the credits ended, the room thinned back to real life. We talked strategy, short, practical, gentle. Maya promised to be with me in any meeting that needed a witness. Ethan offered to scrub my online feeds for comments or whispers we could screenshot. Nina said she'd cook freezers full of food, so I wouldn't default to coffee and nerves. They didn't try to fix my family. They just fortified me. After they left, the apartment hummed with that after-party quiet where you can still hear laughter in the furniture. I washed dishes on autopilot, the water hot enough to sting. My phone lit my peripheral vision, one new email. Subject line formal enough to raise my blood pressure. Notice of intent. I opened it. My father, again. Polite language, sharp edges. He regretted my unwillingness to collaborate and notified me of his intention to initiate legal proceedings if I did not sign over 50% by Monday at 5 p.m. He referenced a long-standing family understanding and suggested I avoid unpleasant consequences to my reputation. The final line, "Do the right thing, Lauren." I read it twice, then a third time with a pen. I circled phrases that mattered: intent to initiate, long-standing understanding, unpleasant consequences, because vague threats love to hide in pretty sentences. I forwarded the email to Marisol with a simple note: new formal ultimatums and reputation threat. She answered in minutes: saved. This helps. Keep copies. No replies from you. I shut off the kitchen light and stood at the window. The city was a pattern of squares, warm, dark, warm again. Somewhere, my parents were writing their version of me. Somewhere else, I had proof of mine. Would you let a lie define your life on paper just to keep peace? I packed a small bag. Not a flight bag. A grounding bag, sweater, notebook, the binder of records, and the set of keys that felt most like mine. Monday's deadline ticked like a metronome I refused to dance to. Before I slept, I mapped the week on a sticky note. Saturday, breathe. Sunday, decide. Monday, stand. When I finally turned my phone to Do Not Disturb, I caught one last glow. A calendar reminder I hadn't set. Family meeting Monday, 5 p.m. It sat there like a dare. I smiled without softness, deleted it, and let the room go dark. The lodge waited in the back of my mind, pine, water, quiet. In the morning, I'd follow that feeling back to the only place that didn't ask me to shrink. And that's exactly where the next surprise found me. Saturday, the city felt too loud for my bones. I threw a sweater and a tape measure in the car and aimed myself toward the mountains. The highway unspooled like a long breath I'd been saving. By the time the reservoir appeared, the knot between my shoulders had loosened enough to let air in. The lodge greeted me with the soft smell of cedar and cold stone. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and let silence climb my spine like warmth. I opened the curtains and the room brightened as if it had been waiting. I wasn't here to hide. I was here to remember why this mattered. I did practical things first. Measured the dock, 37 feet to the end, for boards that need replacing, one rail that wobbles like a loose tooth. I walked the path and flagged spots where spring runoff might gouge the soil. I wrote gravel, drainage, lupin seed in a notebook with a thick pen that made everything feel solvable. Inside, I checked the heater filter, tested the smoke alarms, and listed paint touch-ups, one scuff near the entry, one by the bookshelf where Ethan had danced with the speaker like an idiot. These small repairs steadied me. Paper beats panic. Plans beat fear. I took photos, study shots, not magic hours. The dock from the side so I could count screws. The window trim where the varnish had gone dull. The fireplace stones, each different, none pretending to match. The lodge wasn't delicate. It was honest. Isn't that what I wanted for my life? Mid-afternoon, I made tea and sat on the steps, the cup warming my hands while the air bit my cheeks. An unfamiliar number lit the screen. I almost let it ring into nothing, then answered on an instinct I couldn't explain. A man's voice, careful but direct. He introduced himself. Graham Keller, my father's business partner. He said he needed to talk to me, face to face, about something that couldn't wait. The phrase, couldn't wait, tightened everything I'd just unclenched. He suggested a highway coffee shop off the main route back to Denver. Tomorrow morning. He didn't push. He simply said, "It concerns your father and funds." That pause said the rest. I agreed. We set a time. He thanked me like a person who knows what a favor costs. For a while I stared at the water like it might answer for him. It didn't. The day thinned into winter blue and I packed up, locked the lodge, and traced the road back to the city with my headlights pulling a small circle of safety through the dark. Sunday, the coffee shop smelled like burnt espresso and pastries baked at midnight by someone who'd stopped tasting sugar. I picked a corner booth with a view of the door and wrapped both hands around a paper cup for heat. Graham arrived on time, late 40s, tired eyes, the kind of man who irons his shirt, but not his worry. He slid into the booth, asked if I was Lauren, and didn't waste either of our lives. He said he'd been reviewing accounts at their logistics firm for months, trying to make sense of irregularities that wouldn't balance. At first he thought it was sloppiness, misentered invoices, a payable posted twice, the usual paper noise. Then he noticed patterns, Shipping invoices from a handful of repeat vendors that didn't match any actual jobs, small enough to duck scrutiny, frequent enough to matter. The money flowed to shell accounts with names that sounded like someone's attempt at sounding legitimate. When he pulled longer timelines, the total resolved into a shape that made him sweat. Close to $950,000 over almost 2 years. He didn't dramatize it. He set each piece on the table between us like evidence we could both see. Fake invoices, shell accounts, transfers, dates. He said the word siphoning once, quiet and exact, and let it sit in the air. My stomach processed the word the way the coffee shop processed burnt beans badly. When he confronted my father, the response wasn't denial so much as performance. My father called it temporary reallocation. He promised he had assets he could liquidate and that no one would get hurt. Graham said he asked what assets. My father was vague, then less vague. He mentioned a lakeside property he could move quickly, a clean sale that would square the gap. He spoke like a man planning to sell a weekend, not a daughter's safety. I listened, breathing shallow, hearing two sounds, the scrape of my cup on the table and the memory of my father's voice telling me to keep things dignified. Dignified. I almost laughed. My chest didn't. Graham watched me closely, not with pity, with care. He said he didn't come to weaponize me. He came because decency had an expiration date in their office, and he was done pretending it didn't smell. He told me he'd kept copies, screenshots, bank traces, a timeline because he expected the story to turn violent once truth stood up. He said he'd be filing suit this week and notifying the board. He expected my father to get aggressive fast, and that from the way my name had come up as low-hanging fruit, I needed warning yesterday. I asked questions the way Marisol had taught me. Which vendors? What dates? How were the shells named? He answered until my notes were ugly with ink. He didn't try to soothe me when my hand shook. He just slid an extra napkin across the table and kept going. He apologized once, strange, unnecessary, and said he should have called sooner, but wanted proof stacked high enough to hold in court. He said my father had already tried to pre-sell influence, making calls, hinting at my instability, to a couple of mutual contacts in hospitality. He told me one line that hit like cold water. He's not trying to teach you a lesson. He's trying to make you liquid. I thought of the dock. The way it holds weight without complaint. I thought of the word liquid and hated how accurate it felt. Turn the sturdy into something pourable, shapeless, easy to move. Not me. Not anymore. Graham asked if I had counsel. I said yes. He nodded like that was oxygen. He said I should expect filings as early as Monday and that the first move would be dramatic, stupid, or both. He'll try to make you the problem so he can be the solution, Graham said, and the sentence fit my father like a tailored suit. We sat with the ugliness a moment longer. People came and went around us, cups hissed, a toddler shrieked, the door chimed. The world did not pause to honor my new reality. I thanked Graham for choosing truth over comfort. He said comfort had already left the building. When we stood, he looked like a man walking out of a burning office with the hard drives under his coat. He told me I wasn't alone and that he'd send the documents to my attorney within the hour. I believed him. Not because he promised. Because he brought paper. Outside, the wind cut through my coat and made my eyes sting. I pressed a hand to my phone like it could steady me, then called Marisol before I reached the car. I gave her the headline and the numbers. She went quiet in the way that means she's moving fast. She told me to send everything as soon as Graham forwarded it, and that we'd add motive to the list: embezzlement, asset grab, defamation for leverage. This reframes everything, she said. It did. It turned my father's demand from entitled to criminal. I sat in the driver's seat and let the heater fight the cold. I pictured my lodge cedar, stone, water, like an anchor tied to my wrist. My father wanted it to plug a hole he dug with other people's money. He wanted me small and sellable. I exhaled until my breath fogged the windshield and cleared the patch with the back of my hand. Would you brace for war if the man charging you shared your last name? By the time I pulled onto the road, Graham's email hit my inbox. Screenshots, timelines, transfers, the skeleton of a case. I forwarded it to Marisol, tightened my grip on the wheel, and drove toward a Monday I couldn't postpone. Monday didn't bother with hello. At 8:11 a.m., Marisol called with a voice that meant business had arrived. He filed, she said. The complaint claimed my father had loaned me $230,000 in 2021 for a real estate investment, and until I repaid, he wanted a lien on the lodge. The words felt less like a filing and more like a hand around my throat. I opened my evidence binder while she read highlights. No deposit in 2021. No check. No wire. No text. No email. If a loan existed, it lived only in his mouth. Marisol's tone didn't rise, it sharpened. She said we'd respond line by line, attach statements that painted a year in clean numbers, and move to dismiss the lien request as frivolous. We meet fiction with paper, she repeated, and the phrase steadied my spine. She asked me to stay off direct replies and route everything through her. She'd also draft a preservation notice, names, dates, devices, so no one could conveniently lose relevant messages. If my father wanted a courtroom, he was going to get one with lights on. By noon, I had PDFs exporting like a factory. Bank statements for every month of 2021 clean. Tax returns clean. Brokerage summary clean. I highlighted my actual down payment timeline and the title company wire. The folder looked like a biography told in numbers. Would you keep your voice steady while someone rewrote your life into a debt? At 2:03 p.m., my phone grabbed the room. Voicemail. My father. He started with that gentle sternness he uses on interns and family. Since I'd ignored his fair solution, he said he'd let the courts decide who deserves the property. He mentioned that until I corrected course, he had a responsibility to warn people in his network about my instability. The pauses were deliberate. He wanted me to hear my reputation cracking in the spaces between words. I forwarded the audio to Marisol and typed a transcript while my hands still knew the heat of it. She replied in 10 minutes flat. Good. That's harassment. Keep it. We're adding an attempted extortion claim. We also begin defamation documentation, names, dates, phrases. She attached a draft response to the complaint that read like a scalpel: jurisdiction, lack of standing, absence of consideration, failure to state a claim, request for dismissal, fees. Legal bones, human heartbeat. At 3:27 p.m., Graham's email landed, subject line, materials. Screenshots of the fake invoices. Account traces. A timeline that climbed toward $950,000 like a graph you pray isn't yours. He summarized in bullet points, each one an indictment. The shells, the dates, the repetitive vendor names, the way the money hopped: invoice, shell, personal expense. I didn't realize I'd stopped breathing until the screen blurred and I had to blink myself back. I sent it to Marisol with 2 words, motive attached. She called. This reframes everything, she said. We introduce it as context in our response, credibility and motive. He needed an asset to liquidate, and you were convenient. She would reference Graham's pending suit and attach a sworn declaration if he was willing. She told me to expect fireworks. Desperate men demand matches. We plotted the counter. First, a formal letter to my father's counsel. Direct contact must cease. All communications go through attorneys. Second, our response to his complaint with exhibits, the bank proofs, the closing file, a clean timeline that made his loan collapse under daylight. Third, a counterclaim, harassment and attempted extortion, anchored by his voicemail and the email trail. Fourth, a defamation hold, quiet for now, but ready to file the moment a client's name met a rumor. I breathed, then didn't, then did again. Ethan texted a one-liner, "How's the dragon slaying?" And I sent him a dragon made of spreadsheets. Maya asked about food and electrolytes like I was training for a marathon, which I guess I was. Nina messaged 3 cake emojis and a photo of something chocolate that might save my soul later. By late afternoon, the office lights across my street flicked on one by one. I copied every file to an external drive like I was tucking a child into a safer bed. I made tea I didn't taste and checked my render queue out of habit. The restaurant pendant lights glowed exactly right on my screen. My life outside the mess still existed. That mattered. At 5:42 p.m., Marisol emailed our first volley, a crisp, surgical response with exhibits labeled like soldiers in a lineup. She asked me to read for accuracy. I took a slow pass, correcting one date, adding 2 captions, and then I wrote a short victim impact paragraph she suggested, how the harassment disrupted projects, sleep, and stability. Calm, factual, human. No theatrics. Just light. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I let it go. Another voicemail, this time not family. A client. Her voice was careful. She'd heard something and wanted to check in about my bandwidth. The phrasing was soft, the message not. I felt the floor tilt and right itself. I saved the recording, wrote down her words, and opened a new document titled Defamation, Contacts Log. I pressed my palms to the edge of the desk until the wood pushed back. This was the moment the fight tried to move inside me. I didn't let it. I texted the client, happy to talk tomorrow. I'd call at 10. Then I sent the log to Marisol and asked for language I could use that wouldn't step on the case. She sent 2 clean sentences within minutes. Guardrails. Oxygen. Night folded over Denver. I stacked the signed pages beside the door like armor I could carry. The lodge floated up in my mind, cedar, stone, water, and I held that picture like a compass. My father could pound on glass. He couldn't rewrite the foundation. Just before midnight, my phone lit one more time, another client. Same careful tone, same, are you okay financially? The smear was moving. I hit save on the log and stared at the ceiling until the dark felt honest again. Tomorrow, I'd start calling people back. Tonight, I had one job, stay steady. And then, because timing loves irony, an email from a regional business editor slid into my inbox with a subject line that made my skin prickle. Questions regarding recent allegations about Martin Hayes. The editor's email blinked at me like a warning light. Questions about recent allegations against my father. I didn't answer. I forwarded it to Marisol with one line, press inquiry, please advise, and put my phone face down. Then I picked it up again, because pretending the smear wasn't working wouldn't make it stop. At 10 a.m., I started the calls. I kept Marisol's guardrail sentence in front of me. I'm managing a private family dispute, and someone is spreading false statements about my business. All my projects remain fully funded and on schedule. I let the words do the work. Calm. Clean. Human. Client 1 sounded relieved. She admitted a mutual friend had warned her I was near insolvency and might abandon the project. The phrase near insolvency burned going down. I wrote it exactly into the log: name, date, time, her wording, who told her. She stayed, but paused non-essential upgrades. I thanked her for checking with me directly and sent a follow-up email that summarized our call like a receipt. Client 2 didn't pause. He bailed. He framed it as a timing issue, but his voice tripped over the lie. I asked gently whether anyone had raised concerns about my stability. He exhaled and said he'd been told I was unreliable under pressure and might default on vendor payments. The exact words mattered. I copied them into the log while the end of our contract rang like a soft door closing. At noon, I walked to a cafe with big windows for a face-to-face with client 3. Sun on polished floor. Plates clinking. The table between us felt like neutral ground. She leaned in and, with the care of someone who doesn't want to hurt you, asked if I was okay financially. I told her the truth, yes, and if she was hearing otherwise, that was part of a larger pattern of harassment I was addressing with counsel. The relief showed on her shoulders before it reached her face. Then she said the quiet part. 2 people had called her, my father and a man from his circle, sketching a story where I was about to go under. I wrote it down. The log was a living thing now, a spine I could stand with. Back at my desk, I sent the day's entries to Marisol. She replied almost immediately, excellent. We escalate. She added a draft amendment to our response, defamation spelled out, damages particularized. She asked for written statements, if clients were willing, even short affidavits would help. She also attached a draft for a temporary restraining order, voicemail transcript, emails, timeline, and the spreading of false financial claims as evidence of ongoing harassment. "We're filing for a TRO this week," she wrote. The words steadied my hands. I forwarded the press inquiry again, nervous humor in my subject line. "Press, do I breathe?" Marisol told me to sit tight, route all media through her, and not provide quotes. "A story is coming from the business suit," she said. "Not from you." She copied Graham on a separate thread, requesting a sworn declaration about the embezzlement pattern and the lakeside property comment for motive. He agreed within minutes. Paper. Always paper. Then the smear mutated. A vendor emailed politely to reconfirm payment terms, given chatter. Chatter. Such a sweet word for rot. I replied with dates, numbers, and 3 completed projects in the last quarter. I added him to the log who, when, exactly what he'd heard. The list stretched across 2 pages, phrases like unstable, can't finish, financial strain, each one tagged to a source I could guess even when names weren't offered. At 4:19 p.m., an email from Chelsea landed like a soft knock. She'd told our mother about Graham's evidence. First, denial. Then that brittle silence Elaine uses when she's collecting herself for a narrative pivot. Chelsea said Elaine had started combing through their accounts and found irregular withdrawals and a loan tied to the house she hadn't known about. She had called a lawyer. She had stopped posting grateful family photos mid-caption. The image machine was choking on real numbers. I put the laptop down and let the room settle. Anger has heat, clarity has light. This was light. Not mercy. Not yet. But light. I thought of all the years my mother turned my hurt into aesthetics and suddenly imagined her alone with a paper trail that didn't care about curated captions. I didn't feel triumph. I felt the ground tilt toward truth. Marisol called at 6. She read me the bones of the TRO, no contact, no third-party contact, no interference with clients or vendors, preserve all records. She would file in the morning and request an expedited hearing based on ongoing harm. She asked for one more thing, a victim declaration in my voice. Not emotion. Impact. Specifics. Sleep loss. Projects paused. Revenue endangered. Safety concerns. I wrote it that night in clear sentences that felt like standing up straight. The editor emailed again, this time with a follow-up. He'd heard rumors about my father's company. He asked for a background comment. I did the right thing, no comment, referred to counsel, and immediately wanted to scream into the freezer. Would you stay quiet while the thing that can save you also sets fire to your last name? Silence isn't surrender. It's strategy. I opened my render files because I needed proof my life still existed outside the blast radius. Pendant lights. Banquettes. A shade of green that made a room feel like it knew your favorite story. I adjusted a seam and felt my heart rate slow. Work is its own kind of prayer. By morning, clients started sending notes. One wrote that my father had told him I was on the verge of defaulting on debts. Another said a man from logistics hinted I was overextended. The repetitions helped us. Lies love patterns. Marisol stitched the statements into an affidavit packet and had me sign my declaration in her office. Her pen tapped twice against the desk when we finished, a tiny drumroll. Filed, she said, hitting enter on the TRO motion. Hearing likely in 48 hours. On my way out, my phone buzzed again, Chelsea. A short message, Mom's moving into a hotel for now. She told him she's done covering. Please be careful. I stood on the sidewalk with cold air in my lungs and a new picture in my head, my mother packing a suitcase without taking a single framed photo from the hallway. For the first time in weeks, pity tried to squeeze past my anger. I let a little through and then closed the door. That afternoon, I met 2 more clients. I chose places with light. I told the same careful truth and watched their faces change when they recognized integrity wearing a human face. One signed an addendum to stay on. The other asked what I needed. I said exactly what I needed, patience and silence where rumors wanted noise. She nodded and said she could do both. When I got home, my defamation log had become a map. Each entry pointed back to the same source. Each line was a breadcrumb trail heading toward intent. I scanned the pages into a single PDF and sent it to Marisol with a subject line that felt like a promise. Evidence. Rumor origins. At 7:52 p.m., An email from the court. Hearing set for Wednesday, 10:30 a.m. I read the time 3 times, then printed the notice and taped it inside the binder like a flag. I texted Maya, Ethan, and Nina with the headline. They offered rides, snacks, and dark jokes in equal measure. My body remembered how to exhale. Night collected on my windows. The lodge sat in my mind, cedar, stone, water, and I felt the tug of it down to bone. I wasn't fighting for a pretty place. I was fighting for a life where no one could turn me into liquidity. I turned off the lights and stood in the quiet. The TRO was filed. The date was set. The smear had a paper trail. And somewhere across town, my mother was looking at bank statements she couldn't filter. Would you sleep before a hearing that decides your right to peace? I lay down, not to escape, but to gather strength. Morning would bring fluorescent lights, a judge, and my father's voice filtered by rules he didn't write. The next chapter wouldn't whisper. It would ring. Fluorescent lights hummed like nervous bees. Wednesday, 10:30 a.m. I sat at counsel table with a pen I didn't need, Marisol beside me, spine straight, binder open like a blade. Across the aisle, my father adjusted his cuff and stared at a spot on the wall as if the whole thing bored him. He looked smaller under the bulbs. Maybe truth has gravity. The judge took the bench and asked for brevity. Marisol stood and delivered it, timeline exhibits, the voicemail where my father warned people about my instability, client statements documenting identical phrases, the press inquiry as smoke from a fire he'd lit. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The judge listened to the voicemail twice. The courtroom heard the word instability hang in the air like a bad perfume. Then he read a paragraph from a client's affidavit. She'd been told I might default on vendor payments. He checked the date, checked the source, checked me. I kept my breathing tethered to the pen in my fingers. My father's attorney tried to make it family drama. He said emotions were running high. He said everyone had the right to express concern. The judge looked over his glasses and asked whether concern normally required contacting someone's clients. The silence that followed had edges. Order granted. A temporary restraining order. No contact, no third-party contact, no interference with my clients or vendors. Preserve all communications. The judge's voice landed with the weight of a door closing, firm, final, merciful. He handed the clerk a copy. Paper beat theater again. We walked into the hallway and the world changed temperature. Marisol tapped the order once with her nail, small celebration, then told me to go home, rest, and be ready for the property hearing Friday. We've got momentum, she said. Use it to stay calm. Calm felt like a muscle I was finally building. By late afternoon, Graham's lawsuit hit the docket. The regional business magazine posted a clean, careful piece, an executive accused of siphoning close to $950,000 through fake shipping invoices and shell accounts, suit filed, board notified. No adjectives, just facts. My father's photo, taken at a charity gala, looked like a stranger who had borrowed his face. Have you ever watched a lie lose oxygen in real time? My phone rattled with messages I didn't answer. Chelsea wrote, "It's out." Mom saw. Then, she's leaving. I pictured my mother closing a suitcase without taking a single framed photo, her curated life suddenly allergic to numbers that didn't flatter. Pity rose, then caution held it back. I forwarded the article to Marisol for our file and closed my laptop like a lid on boiling water. Friday, round 2. Different courtroom, same humming lights. This was the property case, the invented loan, the requested lien on my lodge. I wore the same black suit because superstition felt like insurance. Marisol led with documents, the closing file, wire confirmations, 6 years of bank statements and 1,099s, a neat index that made my life legible. No deposit of $230,000 in 2021, she said, and slid the proof forward. The judge turned to my father's counsel. Documentation of the alleged loan? They produced none. No wire, no check, no promissory note, no text, no email. My father stared straight ahead, jaw working. The judge asked again. Still nothing. Paper or silence. There was only silence. Marisol added context, careful but unavoidable. She referenced Graham's suit and supplied his sworn declaration. Months of irregularities, shell accounts, the lakeside property. My father had floated as a quick fix. She didn't accuse, she explained motive. The story clicked together with an ugly logic even the room could hear. My father's attorney tried to pivot family understanding, verbal agreement, support over the years. The judge lifted a hand. We are not litigating gratitude. We are litigating ownership. He leaned back, reviewed the exhibits, and spoke in sentences that felt like stepping stones across a river. Claim dismissed with prejudice. Petition for lien denied. Attorney's fees awarded to the respondent. The gavel didn't bang. It didn't need to. The words did the work. I exhaled without sound and felt my hands at last, heavy mine, steady on the table. Marisol squeezed my arm once, then gathered our binder with the same care she might use packing an heirloom. In the hallway, Chelsea found me. No makeup, eyes red, a jacket thrown over a sweater that didn't match. She said our mother had moved into a hotel and called a lawyer about legal separation. She said a line snapped when she saw the article and the house paperwork. She said she was sorry for the part where her silence paved the road. I nodded. Forgiveness wasn't a light switch. It was a dimmer I controlled. We sat on a bench until the noise of other cases washed past. Chelsea told me our father had spent the morning cursing traitors and rehearsing a speech about being misunderstood. She said it with a flatness that sounded like a door locking from the inside. I didn't savor it. I filed it. Back at Marisol's office, we mapped the next moves. The TRO held. The lien was dead. Fees were ours to calculate and collect. The defamation case would move next. Now we had affidavits, dates, a court order, and an article that made motive legible to anyone with eyes. We pushed for a settlement letter, Marisol said. Payment, retraction, written apology sent to every client he contacted. She looked at me. You okay with that? I was. I wanted paper that repaired what paper had tried to ruin. That night, the lodge tugged at me like an anchor. I drove up alone, windows cracked in the cold. The reservoir was a sheet of black glass, the dock wearing frost like lace. Inside, I lit the fire and sat on the floor with my back to the couch. The restraining order lay on the coffee table, the dismissal order beside it. 2 white rectangles in orange light. Proof that a person can choose where their life goes. I listened to it pop and the heater hum, and my own breath calmed down. I thought about the girl who used to blow out candles alone and the woman who now had to decide what peace looked like. Revenge had never been the point. Integrity was. Safety was. A home that didn't ask me to shrink was. My phone buzzed once. Marisol's late-night email. Expect outreach from his counsel. Momentum is our friend. I smiled into the fire. For the first time in weeks, sleep arrived like a guest who knew where to hang her coat. Would you forgive yourself for taking this long to draw the line? Morning would bring calls, numbers, and a letter my father would hate to sign. But tonight, the lodge held me, the frost held the dock, and the truth on paper finally held the room. Winter laid a clean sheet over the mountains. The lodge breathed heat and cinnamon while my friends tracked snow across the floor with zero guilt. We cooked too much, laughed until the windows fogged, and walked the dock in boots that squeaked on frost. I kept catching myself smiling for no audience. Peace doesn't photograph well. It just fills a room and sits down. Chelsea joined us for one afternoon, no makeup, a knit hat pulled low. She handed me a tin of cookies the kids helped decorate and stood by the fire like a person relearning warmth. We didn't sift the ashes for old explanations. She apologized without theatrics. I said thank you without rewriting the past. Dignity can be small and still be true. January brought an envelope thick enough to matter. Marisol slid it across her desk like a chess piece. Settlement terms, mid, 5 figures for defamation, and a formal written apology sent to every client and vendor he'd contacted. The letter was drafted by counsel, signed in my father's clean, familiar handwriting. No adjectives. Clear retractions. Responsibility stated. I read it twice and felt strangely empty, like my body had been tense so long it didn't know what to hold now. We accepted. Marisol's assistant cued the apology emails and copied me. Subject lines marched out in tidy formation, correction and apology regarding statements about Lauren Hayes. I watched them leave our outbox like birds I didn't need to follow. Then my inbox blinked. First replies, then more. A client who'd paused unpaused. Another returned with a bigger scope and a soft, honest line. We were misled. We're sorry. Would you have cashed the check without reading the apology twice? Work found its rhythm again. I closed one restaurant, launched two more, and took a food hall concept that felt like an art project disguised as rent. My name stopped echoing in the wrong rooms. It showed up on permits and contracts again, anchored to things I could touch: tables, light, color. In March, I finally posted the job ad I'd written in my head during nights I thought I was done expanding. Alana arrived with a portfolio of fresh ideas and a jacket too thin for Denver in spring. She listened more than she talked, absorbed details like oxygen, and asked the kind of questions that make a room better. On her first day, we moved my old drafting table to give her a desk. On the second, she saw a solve I'd missed on a tricky banquette corner and smiled like she'd unlocked a door in a house we both owned. Growth didn't feel like noise anymore. It felt like relief. Graham kept his promise and his spine. The embezzlement case ground forward, filings and hearings, and a board that finally looked. He never shot me for updates. He sent documents and wished me good sleep. I did sleep most nights. When I didn't, I counted the lodge's beams in my head like rosary beads. Chelsea's updates arrived like weather reports. Elaine filed for divorce, moved out, and found a small apartment with actual sunlight instead of ring lights. She hired a forensic accountant and stopped editing her grief for public consumption. I met her once for coffee. We didn't script a new life in an hour. We just sat, sipped, and agreed that truth had been expensive for both of us. On the walk home, the air tasted cleaner than downtown usually offers. By summer, the wildflower path I'd imagined became a real line of color: lupin, paintbrush, shy blooms that refused to brag. I learned to kayak without tipping. Friends came in twos and threes, cooked on the deck, and left me notes in the junk drawer like a silly guest book: Maya's doodle of my fireplace, Ethan's terrible poem about screws on the dock, Nina's recipe for the lemon bars that got me through the worst week. Sometimes news about my father slipped under the door. Bankruptcy filings. A rental on the edge of town with blinds that didn't quite fit. His name whispered as a cautionary example in circles that used to applaud him. The first time I heard it, I felt nothing. The second time, I felt a small grief for a man who could have chosen different. Then I let the feeling go. Boundaries aren't anger. They're shape. Fall cooled the reservoir to steel. My studio calendar filled and kept filling. Alana brought me color studies. I brought her vendor contacts. We both brought lunch, more often than not. The kitchen shelf at the office held a small plant we kept alive out of spite for past chaos. Its leaves reached for the window like it had proof the sun would show up. On my 30th birthday, the lodge looked impossibly itself. Candles flickered against cedar. The last of the wildflowers bent in the wind like they were nodding yes. Friends arrived with noise and a cake that remembered how to delight. We ate too late and laughed too loudly and said things worth hearing twice. When the music softened, I stepped onto the dock alone with a blanket and the kind of quiet I used to mistake for punishment. The water held the sky without flinching. I thought about the girl who waited for calls that never came, the woman who signed for a home with her own hands, and the path between those 2 points. It wasn't straight. It wasn't pretty. It was mine. Behind me, the lodge glowed like a lighthouse that didn't need to warn anyone, just welcome. Chelsea texted a photo of the kids holding sparklers earlier that evening, cheeks pink, eyes wild. Next summer on the water, she wrote. As guests, I replied, a smile in the words, and felt the boundary settle into place without drama. Some doors are open. Some are not. That's not cruelty. That's design. I went back inside to a room I built, to people who showed up without invoices or ultimatums, to work that fed me and didn't ask me to disappear. The apology letter was archived. The check was spent on payroll, paint, and a new sander for the deck. The files were labeled and stored. The fear was not. I stood at the big window and touched the cool glass with my palm, a habit I never broke. The lodge didn't make me whole. It made me honest. The rest was practice, choosing quiet over spectacle, choosing paper over panic, choosing myself over inheritance dressed as love. The fireside. The room exhaled with it. I turned 30 with both feet on my own floor and the dock waiting for morning. And for the first time in my life, the last line wrote itself. I finally belonged to myself.